Welcome, everyone. I'm really sorry about the initial issue with it only letting 100 people in. I mean, with fewer than 100 people, ridiculous. Thank you very much for joining us today. I am Cluster Schmuck, or Dahlia, and I am the head ref of London Roller Derby. Tem, do you want to say who you are?
Hello, I'm Tem, or Themis Killjoy, and I am a roller derby referee based in Glasgow, Scotland.
And our very special ref guest extraordinaire, Kilobyte, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Kilobyte. I am a referee based near London in England.
Amazing. So just as we always start off, a quick introduction, the fact that within this session, there are lots of different people joining us. A third of the people are already officials wanting to join us today. A third don't know anything. They are new to roller derby and they would like to become an official. And a third are players or other folk who have decided that learning the rules will help them out. So when we try and frame things, that is what we're doing. And another reminder that there are over 31 different countries being represented today, and so when we're talking, we are definitely talking from a European and UK perspective, but please do share in the chat kind of if you do things differently or aren't sure about what we are talking about. Last week we spoke a lot about pack definition, the engagement zone, what that all means, and so if you have any other questions on that, please feel free to ask and we'll potentially answer them at the end. As last week, we are going to have 60 minutes of this session about being a jammer ref and around cutting and position, and then half an hour at the end about any questions that you have, either on this session or anything that we've covered so far. The only real feedback that we got given last week were that there are still lots of questions around how do we make this into something that we can really understand and use when we are allowed do the roller derby and go back to scrimming and skating. And the things I want to say are two things. One, that we are going to have a session in a few weeks where we really go over how you can build this in and make it really practical to you. And number two, try not to feel overwhelmed. In the same way that reading the rule book means you won't know everything, these things are built up, right? And actually, when we do go back into scrimming and you go, okay, I've done this course and how do I implement it? Building up skills, taking things slowly, remembering what it was like if you've learned how to skate, to do the things that took you months and months and months, and that relief when you finally got it. It's really similar with being a ref. And at first it will feel impossible. It will feel like your brain can't see all these things, but over time with patience and really building up skills, it will. And we'll talk more about this in a few weeks. And on that note, I'm handing over to Tem and Kilobyte because jammer reffing is not something I know a lot about. And so I'm really excited today to learn with you all.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Dahlia. So I'm just going to make sure my video is the one that's visible. Hello. Yeah, so today, because we're focusing on the jammer referee position and the responsibilities of a jammer referee, we're also going to be looking at some of the theoretical concepts that apply most profoundly to the jammer referee position. And we spoke a little bit in the last couple of sessions about how one of the ways that you could gain an advantage in a game of roller derby is to gain position. And we didn't really talk about what position means. So that concept is going to be absolutely key to how we start thinking about being a jammer referee, thinking about points, thinking about scoring, and thinking about potential advantages in terms of cutting and that sort of thing. So position is the word we use to describe a skater's physical state on the track. So it's not just their position in terms of, are they near the front, are they near the back? It's more, are they in bounds, are they out of bounds, are they upright, or are they down? And then their position is measured purely in a counterclockwise direction, who's ahead of whom. So we never measure relative position going backwards, clockwise around the track. There's no impact to be gained from going clockwise around the track. So we only care about where people are ahead or behind one another in the counterclockwise direction. Let's go on a little bit. So skaters gain position by earning a by passing other skaters. Sorry, I don't have a screen right now. Give me 1 minute. Okay, so sorry, earning position. Skaters gain superior position on other skaters by passing them in the counterclockwise direction. So this is the absolute, like the crux of it, is when one skater's hips pass another skater's hips in the counterclockwise direction, they've earned position. And so on the next slide there, we'll just talk about what passing is. And it is measured by the hips, one center of mass, passing another skater's center of mass, moving from behind them to in front of them, and again, always in this counterclockwise direction. And so that brings us to the idea of cutting. Cutting is the penalty that's issued to a skater who illegally gains position. So by an illegal action, they move from behind an opposing skater to ahead of an opposing skater in the counterclockwise direction. It's illegal for a skater to use the out of bounds area to gain position on someone who is upright and in bounds. However, while it's always illegal for skaters to do that, it's really important to remember that, like all kinds of penalties, there must be impact in order for it to be penalized. And the examples that are given in the rules where cutting does not have sufficient impact on gameplay are when only one teammate is cut, and in situations where a skater immediately cedes by removing themselves fully out of bounds, they cede that advantage they gained by illegally gaining that superior position.
I'm just going to start by saying there's a lot of words on the screen today, and apologies if that's a little bit overwhelming, but you will have the opportunity to watch the video back if you need to, and if at any point there's any questions, you can ask Bex and Owen, who are the moderators, in the chat, and they can pass them on to us, and we'll do our best to answer them for you. First thing I'm going to say before I go on to this basic scenario that's on the screen now is that in addition to a sort of standard cut, you also have an illegal re-entry from the penalty box now also comes under the category of cutting, because it's also gaining position illegally. So that's also in the cutting section. So on screen now we've got a basic cutting scenario. White pivot and white blocker are ahead of red pivot. Red pivot is forced out of bounds by white pivot. White blocker skates clockwise behind both skaters. Red pivot re-enters the track behind white pivot and ahead of white blocker. So the outcome of that is that the red pivot is penalised. And if we go to the next slide, I'll show you why. So the white blocker had superior position when the red pivot went out of bounds. Red pivot is then required to re-enter behind both the white pivot and the white blocker. This next one is, what about if position is lost? So I'll just read through the scenario first and I'll explain it. White pivot and white blocker are ahead of white pivot and white blocker are ahead of red pivot. White pivot forces red pivot out of bounds. White blocker skates clockwise behind both skaters. White blocker loses their balance, takes a knee and returns upright. Red pivot re-enters the track behind white pivot and ahead of white blocker. So the red pivot is penalised because the white blocker lost their position but regained it after they uprighted themselves. The white blocker was not the initiator of the block that forced the pivot out of bounds, so they are able to re-establish their position.
Yeah, and that's the key point there, I think, is that there is there's a distinction between the initiator and a non-initiator about whether they can re-establish any superior position. So once an initiator of a block that has sent someone out of bounds has lost their superior position, then they can't force the cut anymore. But anyone who was a non-initiator in that situation, if they momentarily lose their superior position but re-establish it before the skater who's been knocked out of bounds re-enters, then they have regained their superior position and will lead to a cut. This slide, yes. So we have a lot of questions about, well, what about during a no-pack? Because if there's a no-pack, then no one's in play, so no one has position. So then if I get knocked out during a no-pack, can I just skate in front of everyone? And the answer is no. And we can see if we go back to the definition that we have, and it's important because it doesn't say in play. It says it is illegal for a skater to use the out of bounds area to gain position on someone who is upright and in bounds. So you can still gain position by putting your hips in front of the hips of another person in the counterclockwise direction while there is a no pack situation. However, there are a couple of things to think about. If there is a pack, then skaters who are out of bounds are allowed to re-enter in front of anyone who's out of play. So this, we're talking about out of play in terms of the engagement zone at the front and rear. But if there is a no-pack situation, you measure a kind of pseudo engagement zone based on a 20-foot distance from skaters who were in the most recently defined pack before there was a no-pack. But people who are just in a no-pack situation aren't sufficiently out of play to have lost position to just be cut upon, and skaters make that kind of mistake all the time. Another question we get very often is what is seeding and how do you effectively seed? So if you have illegally gained a superior position, you find yourself on the track in front of someone else, or your jammer does that thing, or a blocker does that thing. Anyone who finds himself having illegally gained a superior position can immediately rectify that by removing themselves fully out of bounds. Now, it's really important that there's a distinction between straddling, being out of bounds, and removing yourself fully out of bounds for the purposes of seeding a cut. If you only ever straddle, or if the skater that you're watching only ever straddles and doesn't remove themselves fully out of bounds, they have not fully removed themselves and they have not yet met the conditions for seeding. What you do see happen sometimes is a skater steps on one foot, is fully out of bounds on one foot, then puts down their inside foot and straddles to recycle. That is acceptable because they haven't come back onto the track, but they must have at some point only been touching outside of the track boundary. And the reason why seeding is allowed, it's kind of a relatively recent rule change, but it's basically just back to that concept of advantage. There is nothing to be gained by momentarily finding yourself accidentally in front of someone who you weren't in front of before. If there's no advantage to be gained, there's no impact on the game, and so no penalty will be issued. What is next? Oh, no.
Yep, that's me. Okay, so what is a jammer referee's role? They have many responsibilities that I've listed here. So following their jammer, counting and signalling score, declaring lead jammer, assessing and calling penalties, communicating, and that's with scorekeepers, other referees, other NSOs, their own jammer, and ending the jam as well. That's a lot. You've got to do all of that while you're on roller skates. So I'm going to share with you briefly a drill that I designed a few years ago with one of my friends. It was originally designed as a jammer ref agility drill, but it's also good for increasing levels of focus as a jammer referee. If you go to the next slide. So what you need to do, obviously, please only attempt this once you are safely able to do so. So once you are able to get back into your practice space, or if you can safely do so anywhere else, please don't, injure yourself. So start by placing 4 cones about 5 feet apart. One referee is in position as if they are a jammer ref ready at the jam start whistle, and then they require a friend as the caller. The caller will blow a whistle. So on the next slide, the caller blows a jam start whistle. The jammer ref sets off as they approach the pack or the cones. They will allow the jammer ref to almost reach each cone and call a number in a sequence without them coming to a halt. So the idea is for you to keep moving and move between the cones as quickly as possible. The aim is to stop in line with the cone number that is called, and then once you get to the end of the sequence, your caller will shout go, and you need to do a lap around after signalling lead jammer, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Jammer ref will join the back of the queue, and if you've got some pals that you're doing this with, the next person starts. Next slide. After you've done that, what you can do is you can add in some additional difficulty, so additional levels of focus. So after they approach the pack for the second time, the caller calls another sequence of numbers, and then they'll finish with a penalty. So the jammer ref who is doing this drill will then have to call a penalty, so whistle, colour, number, penalty, and then issue the penalty on their imaginary jammer. And then on the last slide here, you can add in, instead of using cones, a real life jammer on the track. So the jammer ref is going to follow this jammer between the 4 cones that have been set up or were previously set up, match their skating, call them lead, do a lap, then call a penalty on them. So basically it's an agility drill, but to add in new levels of focus each time you do it. So I've got the link on the bottom of the slide there, and Dahlia will add it into the summary of the session at the end as well.
Most definitely. Thanks for that.
No worries. Okay, so what is lead jammer? Just mentioned about it in that last part. So the lead jammer is the first jammer who establishes a superior position to the foremost blocker in play, having already earned a pass on all blockers, excluding those ahead of the engagement zone. So when one jammer is determined to be the lead jammer, it's indicated by 2 short whistle blasts. It happens as soon as the jammer passes the foremost in play blocker's hips. It's signalled immediately after they do that, and the jammer ref will point at them like this. Hopefully you can see me. So that's as soon as they pass the foremost in play blocker. It's worth noting that when not lead jammer is signalled. It's not signalled until the jammer has exited the engagement zone. That's because if lead status is still open, they do have the opportunity to go back and earn lead jammer if they choose to do so.
So why is the existence of lead jammer important? The lead jammer is the only person who can call off a jam before the full 2 minutes elapse. And the reason that that's significant for gameplay is that if you can control how long a jam lasts, you have significantly more control over the score, and also because you can decide, if you decide when the jam ends, your team can score your 4 points and you call it off before the other jammer is. Can we go back on the slides, back to the slide that we're on? Before that one, I think. This one, yes. So yeah, if you're controlling the clock, you can decide basically how many scoring trips either team is allowed to have. So if you're ahead, you can do what you see people doing a lot, which is earning their first 4 points for their first scoring trip, and then calling it off to prevent the opposing jammer from scoring any points at all. You can also control the score in terms of controlling the margin, because if you are significantly behind and you manage to get lead jammer and you what's happening here? I don't know.
My computer is having a fun time not doing the right thing. Continue as though nothing is happening.
I'm gonna just keep talking about points. So yeah, it also, you can control the margin, because if you have lead jammer when the team is like very far behind, running the jam long, not calling the jam, like making the most of that opportunity where you have lead jammer in your control of the clock, minimizes the amount of time that the team who is ahead can run away with the score. And the other thing, not just controlling the clock, but you control the jam start conditions. Often you will see that lead jammers call off the jam when a particular opposing jammer has been sent to the penalty box, when a certain number of blockers are in or out of the penalty box. So if you can control when the jam ends, you can control who is still in the box, who is not in the box, who's been released so far, and this kind of stuff. And it's really important to understand these kind of tactics as a referee, because as a jammer referee, you need to be prepared to anticipate when your jammer is likely to call off the jam. And that's not to say that you should preempt it and call off the jam for them. That's absolutely not the point at all. But it's more that you need to be ready to be in the right position to make sure that you can prioritize seeing the exact moment when the jammer taps their hips for the second time. Because at that moment, that is what that team and that jammer has decided that the clock should be managed in that way. So it's your responsibility as a jammer referee to be as vigilant as possible about doing that accurately, so that the conditions that they want, the score that they want, those kinds of things can be maintained accurately. And if you are unable to anticipate those potential sort of tactical ideas, then you're more likely to make your jammers very unhappy. Managing that relationship is another very important part of being a jammer referee.
So someone has asked in the chat, once the jammer has left the engagement zone, are they no longer eligible for lead? So hopefully I'm going to answer that now. When is a jammer eligible? Jammer becomes ineligible to earn lead during a jam if they commit a penalty during that jam, exit the front of the engagement zone without having earned lead, remove their helmet cover, or have their helmet cover removed by a teammate. Only skaters who begin the jam as jammers may become lead, so pivot who receives a star cannot become lead.
Yes, and most jammer referees will have a particular strategy for tracking eligibility in this way. I know that Kilobyte and I both have the same system of using 2 whistles, one lanyard whistle and one finger whistle. We begin the jam with our lanyard whistle in our mouth, and at the moment that the jammer is called lead, if my jammer is called lead,
I mean, we are having a fun day today with technology. I am really sorry about that. I think Zoom just crashed, so that's good. We will wait for a few more people to be back in the room, and then we will get back. So, okay, Tem, back to you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so we track eligibility with the lanyard whistle in the mouth, and if your jammer's lead, we keep that whistle in the mouth for as long as they're lead, so that you know that you can call it off and you have the whistle ready in your mouth to call it off. And that means that if your jammer loses the eligibility to become lead, if at any point the jammer removes their helmet cover, does any of the things that Kilobyte just described, if you let the whistle drop out of your mouth, then you know that you cannot accidentally call lead jammer. Similarly, this dropping the whistle is really useful for when lead is lost. So even if you've blown the lead jammer whistles, your jammer is lead, but then for some reason they lose lead jammer status, which would come from something like if they commit a penalty, if they intentionally remove the cover once it's already on their head, or if they have the star intentionally removed by a teammate, then these are situations where even if they've earned lead jammer status, they've now lost it. And so I would track that in the same way by dropping the lanyard whistle from my mouth. And you also should bring down the hand that is pointing to the jammer to tell them there's lead, because as long as you're pointing at the jammer, they are entitled to believe that they are the lead jammer and to act as though they are the lead jammer. So it's important to drop your hand as well. Okay, what's next? Scoring. So we're talking about jammers and lead jammers and scoring points and how you affect the clock and all that kind of stuff, but we haven't actually spoken about the basic principles of how points are scored in roller derby. So we've discussed how you earn position. Earning position and earning points are pretty much identical concepts. So the jammers score 1 point every time they earn a lapping pass, establish superior position on an opponent, on an opposing blocker. And so that's a full lap, so passing a skater twice in a row without that skater having also passed them in between. And all blockers are always considered to be on the same trip. So that means that for each trip through the pack, there are 4 possible points that can be gained by a jammer. If a jammer, and this is a question that came up last week, if a jammer completes a scoring trip having had no opportunity to pass anyone and to earn any points, they are automatically awarded the points that they didn't have the opportunity to earn. And the point of this is to kind of minimize shenanigans around scoring avoidance, because if you could manipulate the score by making, just, I'm going to take myself away and fix my toe stop now, and then that means the pack is suddenly 20 feet further away in the last 3 seconds of this jam, so the opposing jammer can't score now because I just went over here, then that would obviously impact gameplay quite a lot. So if skaters are impossible to be passed, there's no opportunity at all for a jammer to pass anyone, then those points are automatically awarded. Yes.
So, as we talked about earlier, if an initiating blocker loses position, say they hit the jammer out, for example, and then went off the track with them, the jammer can re-enter in front of that skater legally as they lost their position. So this slide is about a scenario from the casebook about a no earned pass. So white jammer is on their second trip through the pack. They earn a pass on all opposing blockers except red pivot, who is in front of them. Red pivot forces white jammer out of bounds and then goes out of play. Red pivot turns around, returns to play, and ends up behind white jammer, who is still out of bounds. White jammer re-enters in front of red pivot and just ahead of the engagement zone. So in that scenario, the jammer would score 3 points. When white jammer re-entered the track outside the engagement zone, their second trip through the pack was complete. At that time, red pivot was in play. As such, white jammer had the opportunity to earn a pass on red pivot during that trip through the pack by returning to play inside the engagement zone and then passing the red pivot. So they could have opted to go back and score on that red pivot if they had wanted to.
Yeah, so a skater failing to take advantage of the opportunity to score on someone doesn't automatically grant that point. And that's a really important distinction, is that like when a skater has the opportunity to pass someone but doesn't pass them successfully, then it's a no earned pass situation, and that's why sometimes fewer than 4 points can be scored on any given trip. But if it's the actions of those skaters that are preventing them from being scored upon, then those are the kind of situations in which the points are automatically awarded. Okay, the next scenario is fairly complex, so bear with me as I talk through it, but this is something in there for some of the potentially more experienced jammer referees out there. I'll talk through it and hopefully it's clear. So the black jammer is on their second trip through the pack and passes white blocker 1 legally before removing their helmet cover and attempting to pass the star. White blocker 2 is penalized for star pass interference and is sent to the penalty box. Black jammer legally passes white blockers 3 and 4 with their helmet cover still in their hand, but is issued a forearm penalty before leaving the pack. While black jammer is in the penalty box, white blocker 3 is issued a penalty and leaves the track. Black jammer puts the helmet cover back on, is released from the penalty box, and fully re-enters the track 30 feet behind the rearmost pack skater right before the 4 jam-ending whistles sound. So the question here is, at the end of this jam, when those 4 whistles sound, how many points should the jammer referee hold up? I'm just going to go through the scenario again because it's a little bit complicated. So you have the black jammer, they're on their second trip through the pack, so they're on a scoring trip. They legally pass 1 blocker. Then they take off their helmet cover, they're no longer wearing a hat, no star, and they attempt to pass the star. A blocker who is ahead of them is penalized, goes to sit in the penalty box. And then with the star still off, they pass the other 2 blockers. Then they get sent to the penalty box. And while they're in the penalty box, one of the blockers that they passed without the star on is also sent to the penalty box. Then they put the star back on, are released from the penalty box, fully re-enter the track, out of the engagement zone at the back. And so the question is, how many points? So there's a question about a visualization. I don't really have any way to give a visualization for this situation because I don't know how I would demonstrate it visually. Okay, so I'm going to give the answer. The answer is 3 points. Now, most people have, the majority of people, 53% of people who have responded have answered 1 point. And my guess would be that's because only 1 skater was passed with the star visible on their head. Now, The answer is that it's 3 points because of a little known and often ignored point in the rules, that is that if the jammer renders themselves unable to score points for any reason, any not on the track points that they would have scored had they been able to earn points are awarded and are considered earned as soon as they become re-eligible to score points. So at that moment, at the end of the jam, when the jammer fully re-enters the track boundary, is in a scoring position because they're on their scoring trip, they have the star visible, the helmet cover on their head, and they're fully in bounds. At that point, they would gain the 2 not on the track points that they're entitled to because of the 2 white blockers who went to the box who hadn't been legally passed otherwise. Now, this is only true because they did legally pass the first white blocker with the star visible before they went to the box themselves. If they hadn't scored anything, if they'd gone to the box without having already scored a point, if they didn't put the star back on before the jam ended, if they didn't fully re-enter the track boundary before the jam ended, they wouldn't get those points. The key thing is that they earned 1 point legally and that not on the track points existed, and then they rendered themselves able to score again by meeting all of the required conditions for being scoring, which is being upright, in bounds, and having a visible star. So yeah, 3 points. Fun. 25 people answered that correctly. Congrats. All right, so then the next scenario is...
Okay, so white jammer is on their second trip through the pack and jumps the apex. Everyone loves an apex jump question. Passing all 4 red blockers while mid-air. White jammer's right skate lands in bounds with their hips ahead of all blockers. As a result of the same action, white jammer's left skate subsequently lands out of bounds. So the question is again, how many points do they score?
I mean, we will win against technology, but we'll see how this goes today. There were so many questions about that previous scenario, and we have collected them, and we will go through more of the questions right at the end. There will be a poll. We're very sorry that Zoom and technology does seem to be against us, but we're doing okay for time. Thank you for your patience. And also, on a personal note, I'm really enjoying all the chats about outrage, about, you know, how many points are there meant to be. So I look forward to the last half hour when we go through everything once again in with any of your questions. So at that note, I'm going to share my screen again and hand it back to Kilobyte.
I will just say quickly that there was a question about pointing to which part of the rules says the mind-blowing thing that I put out there just now, and it is section 3.3 within scoring avoidance. So it's in the same section that talks about automatically earning passes for people that have made themselves unscorable. There's a section that is bolded in the WFTDA rules that's about a jammer rendering themselves unable to score points. 3.3.
Dahlia, are we able to get the poll on this, or should I just skip to the answer? Oh, there is.
Do you want to read it out?
Yeah, I'll read it out again. Yep. White jammer is on their second trip through the pack and jumps the apex, passing all 4 red blockers while mid-air. White jammer's right skate lands inbounds with their hips ahead of all blockers. As a result of the same action, white jammer's left skate subsequently lands out of bounds. Okay. So 63% of you said 4 points. And if Dahlia can go to the next slide, you'll see that that is the correct answer. So white jammers' inbound status was maintained while airborne because the first part of their skate to touchdown touched inbounds. White jammer's upright status was maintained while airborne because they touched the floor skate first. The fact that white jammer touched out of bounds with the other skate does not affect points, but does affect their subsequent position relative to the skaters they passed while airborne.
So this situation is a really good example. Sorry, just still back on this one. Yeah, it's a really good example to demonstrate that there is a bit of a difference between earning position, earning a pass, and establishing position. So by putting their foot down in front of everyone, they earn those points, but with their other foot going down, and they're then, you know, in a potential cutting position there if they would continue to skate, because they haven't actually established a position fully in bounds. And so that's why often you can see as well that people, if this situation was on an initial trip, if the jammer landed 1 foot in bounds, they would be potentially immediately awarded lead jammer. But if they would continue to skate at that moment, they would then be given a cut. So lead would be lost immediately. And a lot of the time, jammers who are awarded lead and then immediately called on the cut or some similar thing look at you in a very confused way as a jammer referee. It's really important to understand that you can earn lead without having fully established yourself in that position. Like hips can pass very briefly. You earn the pass before having then like fully established yourself for the purposes of things like cutting.
I would say that I think that nuance is really important. And I think the thing that Kilobyte said earlier about having, you call lead the moment they pass the hips, but you don't call not lead until they're out the engagement zone. And like that difference is really important exactly for this kind of scenario where it's that second they pass the hips and then other things can or can't have happened and all that other kind of stuff. But that's why that hip moment is really important, and not to get them confused with lead is out the engagement zone. It's those hips.
Great, thank you. Okay, so then we have one more scenario. The pink jammer is on their second trip through the pack and jumps the apex just as the jam ending whistles begin. They pass all 4 blue blockers while mid-air before the 4th whistle of the first set of 4 whistles. The pink jammer lands fully in bounds with their hips ahead of all blockers in the second set of 4 jam ending whistles. The question here is, how many points? Okay, so this is divided the room a little bit here. 43% say 0 points, 57% say 4 points. So the answer here is 0 points. And that's because the jammer does not re-enter inbounds before the jam has ended. The jam ends on the 4th whistle of the first set of 4 whistles, the d-d-d-d of the jam ending whistles. Now, in this scenario, the jammer is not in bounds in front of anyone when that happens. They do not land until the second set of 4 whistles. The jam is already over. It doesn't matter that they've passed everyone in midair, so their hips have technically passed everyone, but they cannot maintain their inbounds upright status until they land. And because they don't land until after the jam has ended, no points are awarded. Great. Okay, so this is just going into a little bit more detail of the passes that we talked about earlier on, because I know it caused a little bit of confusion in the chat because we kind of brushed over it. So I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail there. So the crux of this, if a jammer completes a scoring trip having had no opportunity to earn a pass on an opponent, that pass is considered earned upon the completion of that trip. So those are situations where an opponent is ahead of the engagement zone when the jammer completes their trip through the pack by exiting the front of the engagement zone. So if a jammer we said earlier on that once a jammer leaves the front of the engagement zone, they can't go back and repass anyone that they didn't score on. So if they've passed 3 blockers, left the engagement zone at the front, and the 4th blocker was ahead of them the whole time and ahead of the engagement zone in front of them, it would be very unfair on that jammer to only allow them 3 points, and to, once they've left the engagement zone, their points are final. So in this moment, because that jammer because the blocker ahead of the engagement zone never gave the jammer an opportunity to earn their point is awarded or earned, considered earned, on the completion of that trip as they exit the engagement zone at the front. The same is true for opponents who are ahead of the engagement zone at the end of the jam when the jammer is within their trip still. If the jam ends and someone was out of the engagement zone at the front, effectively they could just keep skating forever and stay far away from the jammer illegally, and then it would force the jammer to not be able to score as many points. Those points are also automatically awarded because the rules don't want to reward anyone maintaining an out of play position or an unscorable position. So this is again under scoring avoidance in that section 3.3. Any not on the track points that the jammer cannot earn because they complete their trip through the pack without the opportunity to earn a pass on any opposing blocker. Now this was a situation that came up last week where someone asked, what if there's no pack because there are no skaters from one team on the track and the skater just skates a whole lap? How did they get any points? And the answer is they would get all 4 points because they had no opportunity to earn any legal passes, so those are considered earned as soon as they complete a trip. The question there is, how did they complete a trip if there's no pack and there's no engagement zone? How would you know when they entered and then left the engagement zone? And again, as we talked about position before, it's about the 20 feet in front and behind the foremost and rearmost pack skaters of the most recently defined pack. So if a skater completes a trip in a complete no pack situation, you would measure the beginning and end of the engagement zone 20 feet from where the pack was most recently defined. And then the very last point on automatically earned passes is opponents who are out of play behind the pack if a jammer re-enters from the penalty box in front of that blocker. So again, this is about not rewarding anyone for maintaining an out of play position. That if a blocker who's out of play behind the pack sees the jammer re-entering and is kind of like, oh, maybe I'll just chill back here because, this would be a no earned pass on me, and then they won't get that point. Whereas actually if I skate forward and rejoin the pack, the jammer passes me. If they're not on the track points, they get all those points as well. So the idea is that there is no reward to be gained for making yourself unscorable.
So we've got 5 minutes left, and I'm going to attempt the impossible and cover star passes in 5 minutes. So what is a star pass, first of all? A star pass is when a team's jammer transfers the position of jammer to their pivot. So that requires the jammer to hand the star while they're both upright, inbounds, in play, and while neither skater is en route or in queue for the penalty box. People often have a lot of questions about star passes and like to fabricate weird and wonderful scenarios about them. But we're not going to talk about it forever because it's either a star pass or it's not, as long as you follow those simple rules. So upon releasing the star into the pivot's grasp, the position of jammer is transferred to the pivot, and the new jammer will take over for the previous jammer in terms of points scored, trips through the pack, and the skaters passed. And then the previous jammer becomes a non-pivot blocker.
Yeah, the main thing to consider about star passes that people kind of get tripped up on a lot is that a star pass that fails and that is unsuccessful or is incomplete is not necessarily illegal or immediately penalizable. So in a situation, for example, where a jammer takes off their helmet cover and throws it to the pivot, and the pivot catches it. Sometimes you'll see a jam referee immediately blow the whistle and this is a star pass violation because you can't do that. And it's like, it's true that that's not a star pass, but it's just that these people have not successfully done the star pass thing. They need to stop, and it just becomes a star recovery, that the pivot's then like, well, I'm holding the star, I can give it back to the jammer can pass it back to me, now there's a star pass again. So it's really important as a jammer referee to know the difference between which things are illegal, which things are, okay, you can't release the star into the hand of someone who's out of bounds and all these things, which things are illegal, which things become penalty worthy, and which things are just unsuccessful attempts at being at doing star passes. And yeah, we don't have a lot of time to go into the nuances of that now, but there are lots of casebook scenarios that will go over those in more detail. And the main thing is just not to be too trigger happy as a jammer referee, that as soon as you see something during a star pass that you know is not right, that you know is not a successful star pass, it doesn't mean you need to immediately blow your whistle and penalize somebody, because a lot of the time they've just done it wrong and they just need to fix it.
Worth noting on that as well, if a star pass is illegal, then the initiator of the star pass will receive a penalty. So if a jammer tries to pass the star to their pivot who is fully out of bounds, then, and the pivot puts it on their helmet, then the jammer will receive the star pass violation for that.
Yes.
Okay, so that was 16 minutes of jammer refereeing, cutting, positions, star passes, and obviously there can be time for a lot more. So as always, we're going to have now anyways, we're going to have 30 minutes of questions, and there are lots, and we've collected a lot of them that kind of vary from how do you communicate if a star pass has happened, all the way back to the scenarios we spoke about earlier and asking just a bit more detail and a bit more questions on that. So do hang around if you would like to, but if you don't want to, see you next week. Thank you very much for joining us. And people have asked if you need to pay for this. You don't, it's entirely free, and we're trying to make it as accessible as possible. If you did enjoy it and want to donate though, please feel free to donate to London Roller Derby or any food banks around where we train at London Roller Derby. For people who are leaving, I'm going to thank Kilobyte now. Thank you for joining us. Kilobyte is going to hang around for the next half of questions. And as we have started to do, I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a moment, and we're going to test you a little bit on penalties and hand signals and all that kind of fun stuff to help keep things going. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Hello, everyone.
Gallo review.
Tem, do you want to start us off on a penalty review?
Yes. So, what is the hand signal for a cut? Yeah. It's like scissors. Control X. Cut and paste. Kilobyte, go on. You do one.
What is the hand signal for an illegal re-entry?
Yeah,
Yeah.
We'll go into questions in a bit. Okay. What is the hand signal for low block? Oh, I'm seeing a mixture of low blocks and legs blocks. Yep. Low block is this. Leg block is pointing to the leg. They both begin with L. It'll take time. It's confusing. I say that as someone who's dyslexic and get all of my words confused quite so regularly. So yeah, Tem, one more for you and then we'll go on to questions.
Okay. What signal would you use to indicate lead jammer?
Yeah. Whenever I have jam ref, which is like a minimal amount of times, thing that I always get confused about is when we talk about a lanyard whistle, we're talking about the whistle that goes around your neck, and I will often use a finger whistle instead, but I will often then have my finger whistle accidentally on the hand that's nowhere near me. So I feel like that with time and expertise, I will stop doing that. Oakley dokley. So we are going to go to questions. We've been collecting them as we've been going. So Tem and Kilobyte, are you happy for me to just read things out, or do you want to choose them? What would you prefer?
I would deal better with you reading them and not having to look through them.
Sure.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, let's go with that.
Cool, we will do that then. Okay, so this is going way back to the beginning of the session. Someone asks, if I am blocking alone and there isn't anyone around, can I go out of bounds and use a shortcut?
Do you want me to take that one, Tim?
Yeah, I don't understand the question. So
Okay, so no, it's a simple answer, but it doesn't come under the category of a cutting penalty. It would come under skating out of bounds. So you cannot shorten your distance by using out of bounds area. So no.
yes,
Cool.
so that would be illegal position.
There you go.
Yeah. And you might notice that sometimes the jammer, as they're going, might cut a little bit. You know, if they're going around and they'll go on the apex and they'll slightly cut a little bit of the track. If it's a small amount and it doesn't happen repetitively, you probably won't get a cut for that. But if you begin to notice that, like, it's not seen to be intentional, it's not seen to be trying to cut any distance, you won't get a penalty initially. If that happens repetitively, which is often deemed 3 times, you will get a penalty for actually skating out of bounds and cutting that distance around the apex, which is when it kind of happens the most. Next question. The question I had was whether the cutting ahead of one teammate is okay in any scenario. I thought this was only allowed in illegal re-entry scenarios, i.e. coming back from the box.
Yep, no, so that's the thing, is that illegal re-entry and cut are just 2 sort of ways of communicating the details of the fact that a skater has illegally gained position using the off the track area, and they are the same penalty now, the same hand signal and everything, and the conditions that need to be met are the same. So whether you're re-entering from the penalty box or re-entering having been knocked out of bounds, it is not considered sufficient impact for a penalty to cut one teammate.
Thank you very much. Okay. Why is it okay to straddle the line while being run back? I thought you could not use the track to legally seed. Follow up, clarify that the straddle skater doesn't need to have fully exited before straddling while running back, just have to fully exit before fully re-entering. Does that make sense?
Yes, so what I will clarify is that they do have to fully exit before straddling. Like, you need to immediately fully take yourself out of bounds. The point is, sometimes that happens very swiftly. It happens on one foot, or it happens very, very briefly, and then the skater continues to seed with 1 foot inside, 1 foot outside, straddling the track boundary. And at that point, because they've gone from being fully out of bounds to straddling, they're still out of bounds, and they're seeding fully while out of bounds. So they need to immediately leave the track fully, but then they haven't cut until they fully re-enter. So as long as they immediately take themselves fully out of bounds, they can then straddle for as long as they want until they fully re-enter.
Cool. I'm just going to say that at 1/4 if there's anyone who has a question, they don't want to write it down, they would rather speak, please make it known. Say something like, I've got a question in the box, and Holtz or Owen will take note of that, and then you can turn on your microphone and you can ask your question. Just be aware, if you do unmute yourself, you will be recorded. So that's at 1/4. There's a question that I think I can answer, and Tem and Kilobyte can let me know if I'm wrong. If the jammer starts in the penalty box, and when no one has gained lead yet, if the jammer leaves the box without the star on their head, They can't gain lead, can they? So I'm going to reword that a little bit. A jammer starts in the penalty box. The cover is off their helmet. They go on the track. Can they gain lead? Now, my understanding, which I'm nervous about, but we'll see, it's all a learning moment, is you can start in, if you start in the box and you don't have the helmet cover on and you are the jammer, like the star is visible, everyone knows you're the jammer, you go on the track, you put the helmet cover on and then go through legally and do everything that we've just said that you need to do, you can get lead. If, however, you're in the box, you go on the track, you've still got your helmet cover off your helmet, the start, and you go through, you then can't get lead. 10 kilobyte, how accurate?
Yes, that's accurate. I will add to that though, that if you had the helmet cover on at any point, you can't then so say you have the helmet cover on and you're in the box, and then you realize a little bit too late that the other jammer has, the jam's already started, the other jammer gets penalized, you're still in the box, and you're like, oh, now I can get lead. I've taken the helmet cover off. I just know I can put it back on again. If it was on your head at any time and you take it off, then you lose eligibility. So it has to have, you have to start the jam with it off your head and in your hand. And the first time it goes on your head is, it stays on, and then you earn every pass with the star visible and on. So you can't put it on, take it off, and then put it on again.
When we talk about a star being visible, what do we mean? 10 kilobyte. Do you want me to do it?
Yeah, you
visible.
You can answer that one if you want. Visible stars.
Kilobyte can do it. It's all right. Start talking. Go for it.
So visible, as in on their head, the right way round. Yeah.
Yeah. So actually in a captain's meeting, you will often have a head ref who will ask whether a star is your helmet covers are reversible, because actually at that point, if they're reversible, whichever you put them on, they are visible, you can see them. If they're not reversible, then we make it really clear it will not count as a star being visible if we cannot see the star in the way it was intended to be seen. So
can I add something to that quickly? Because
it.
I've seen some teams that have their home colours on one side and their away colours or their light and their dark colour reversible that way. Even though in that sense, if you turned it inside out, there would be a star visible. It wouldn't count as a visible star if the base colour of your helmet cover doesn't match the base colour of your jersey. Because you're wearing the wrong kind of helmet cover. So even though there is technically a visible star happening, if you happen to have strange helmet covers that are one color on one side and your other color on the other for efficiency or whatever in your scrimmages, if you're wearing them the wrong way around, they may not be considered visible, even if there's a star happening, if it's the wrong color.
Yeah, definitely. So you're still the jammer, you're just inactive, which is often the term that we use. Does a jammer earn point on opposing blocker who is not upright?
Yes.
Yes.
This trips people up a lot because they know that they see oh, passes have to happen while upright and inbounds. That condition is on the jammer. That condition is on the person scoring the points. The jammer has to be upright and inbounds. If the jammer passes someone who is not upright, or passes someone who is not in bounds, they just score those points normally as long as the jammer is upright and in bounds. Kind of relatedly as well, there's a distinction between a jammer who is down, who passes someone while down, and a jammer who is down, who someone then passes in the clockwise direction. A jammer who gets knocked down, slides on their knees, hips pass hips, and they stand back up. This is a no earned pass situation. They weren't upright and inbounds when they passed that skater. If the jammer falls down and is stationary on the ground, and an opposing blocker moves from a superior position into a position behind the jammer while that jammer hasn't moved on the ground, they're considered to have given up their point, and the point is considered earned. So it's important to know who is moving in those situations. But yeah, the point scoring thing, the jammer is the one that has to be upright and inbounds.
So we're going to have a future session a bit on communication, but whilst we do have Kilobyte here, what kind of communication does a JamRef use with other OPRs, with the other JamRef and the IPRs? In a brief way, because we are going to talk a bit more about communication in a future session.
So personally, I like to communicate where my jammer is, and I like to know where the other jammer is as well. So I might say my jammer's on the outside, at the back, or at the front. IPRs will often use the lead is open, lead is closed communication, which is really useful to know whether the other jammer has received lead or whether it's still up for grabs for my jammer. One that people might have seen before is from OPRs. If the jammer's calling the jam and it can't be seen clearly from the inside, but the OPRs can see it, OPRs might tap their helmet. Just to point out, that's not an official hand signal, but it is useful. So that would be something that you would discuss in your pre-game crew meeting if that's something that you wanted to use. But personally, I find that really useful. If I can't see that the jammer is calling the jam, but the OPRs can, I will take their advice and make sure I'm in a position to confirm that is the case.
I will add to that a couple of other unsanctioned, unofficial hand signals, verbal cues things. I have quite a lot of those as a jammer referee, and it's a kind of, I think I probably have one of the more extended jammer referee scorekeeper conversations that people can have. Mostly because I've been caught out too many times by fringe situations and not having a way to describe fixes and things on the fly. So I have a system to communicate score corrections that I would always talk over with my scorekeeper before the game, so that I don't have to skate to the score table, or that we can do score corrections mid-jam. And I also have a signal for there should be a cross in the lost lead box, which is either lead was gained and lost, or eligibility to become lead was lost. And often that's something that a scorekeeper knows better than you do. But sometimes there are situations, for example, if your jammer becomes ineligible for lead because they remove the helmet cover, and at pretty much the same time, the other jammer, who's also on their initial trip, is penalised and loses eligibility for lead, it's important to know that your jammer lost eligibility as well. No, sorry, not as penalised. The other jammer gets lead at the front. So if my jammer removes their helmet cover and moments later the other jammer is given lead jammer, this is a lost lead situation. And that's something that, like, actually it's not super relevant, but it is relevant in terms of stats. It's good for teams to know if a particular jammer is regularly getting crosses in the lost lead box, why are they giving up their eligibility for lead? And it wouldn't be recorded at all if it were only recorded that the other jammer was the lead jammer, because you don't put anything to say that, like, I'm not the lead jammer, they are the lead jammer. So if you have information like, yeah, actually this jammer lost their eligibility to be lead, or actually anything to do with the game, really, like if you have information that you think should be recorded and there is like a system for recording it, you know, the score paperwork exists and it's important and it records important information. So it's your responsibility as a jam ref to communicate those things as well. So I have all kinds of complicated hand signals.
And the thing that I would say, similar to kind of how I tried to introduce the session today, is that the more you do this, the more you will learn the things that are helpful to communicate. But it really is okay to prioritize and start off really with the basics and try and getting that right. And then once you get to the level of TEM and Kilobyte, where, you know, you're at champs and you really want to make sure that all the officials, the NSOs, the skating officials, are really communicating, everything is as smooth and clear as possible. By that point, you'll have built up all these different layers of communication to really work as a team of officials rather than skating officials, non-skating officials. It is 1/4 past, so we're going to keep going with questions, but if you have questions about... Oh,
Sorry, I had one more to add to that as well, Dahlia, that's quite important as well. I don't know whether Tem does this as well, but I use jammers unmarked. So if my jammer removes their helmet cover, communicating that to the other jammer ref and also to the pack referees to say, my jammer's not wearing a cover anymore, but they're still the jammer.
Yeah.
That I find so helpful as an IPR. When I'm inside pack reffing and I'm trying to count the pack and who's in the pack and where the engagement zone is, when a jammer ref is communicating to me that someone is unmarked, it is so helpful, because then you don't accidentally say, well, pack is back, and you're like, no, that's the jammer. So that kind of communication is really helpful. So we're going to go to one question from someone who has made it clear they would like to continue to ask questions, ask them about this week.
Can I, sorry,
yeah, go for it.
Also just quickly, because I've had some messages about my like signals and stuff. I want to say that it's really important to like regulate what you do and say based on like the scorekeeper that you're working with as well, and the level of game and the level of experience. And so like me having said I have a ridiculously long scorekeeper conversation is like not necessarily the right thing or the good thing to do. It depends on the circumstance. Like if I'm working with a scorekeeper who is really confident, you know, often I work with scorekeepers who are much better officials than I am and much more experienced officials than I am, then that's when I'll do things like, I have all of these different signals and we're going to use to communicate these things that you know about and we can understand together. There is no point in overloading someone who is at a different experience level with scorekeeping with signals that don't make sense to them.
100%. To kind of do a bit of a shout out to someone who's actually on the thing at the moment, when I was jam timing, that's an NSO position with Toxic, who was on scoreboard, I probably had the least amount of communication with him that I've ever had with any scoreboard operator, even though they were the most high level, intense, exciting games of my jam timing career. But it's actually because we were really in sync with each other. We knew what we were doing. We had the basic hand signals. And it really depends on how the game is going and who you're officiating with as to what level of communication you need, and you will learn that eventually. And I have a tick list of things because it can be overwhelming to try and remember stuff, and like it just comes with time. So Riff, who has the question? Riff.
That's me.
Hello.
Yes.
Question.
Hi. My question is about illegal versus incomplete star passes. When I started, illegal star passes were given immediately when the star was illegally given to, say, like if the jammer was down and illegally gave the star to the pivot, it was given immediately then. So what's the difference now that makes it incomplete versus illegal and penalizable?
Okay, so I'll talk about this one a little bit. The difference is really back in the concept of impact. Like, it is true that we used to be much more quick to penalize failed or unsuccessful star passes, and actually this has changed over time, because just like being able to seed a cut, like if you can fix it, if a pivot finds himself in control of a star that they shouldn't have, they can just give it back. Like, that's a star recovery. But in situations, for example, where so there's a casebook scenario for it where a jammer hands the star to a non-pivot blocker, and previously, if the non-pivot blocker takes that star, this is immediately a star pass violation. But actually, it's not the case if they just immediately drop it. There has been no impact on the gameplay. Like, if they keep hold of it, if it confuses the other skaters, if people think that someone else is the jammer, if things continue, if it has any meaningful impact on the game, then we penalize those things. So you're looking for example, in situations where the star passes have been incomplete and unsuccessful, if the jammer and the pivot have retained their original position, the impact comes when the pivot then puts the star on anyway, or when the pivot refuses to remove the star after having been warned, or where the non-pivot blocker who is in control of the star doesn't immediately release it once they know what's happened. And it's if there is that moment, just like when seeding, if you can immediately seed any advantage that could potentially be given by that situation, you don't gain anything by faffing about with the star being confused yourself. Like, no one's scoring points, no one's going anywhere or doing anything. And as soon as it gets to a point where someone gains something, that's when it gets penalized. So it's just a little bit more breathing room to fix something that you've done wrong, because we all make mistakes. And things like a non-pivot blocker, for example, skaters who are used to pivoting and jammers who are used to having that person as their pivot, and then they're not the pivot because they were in the box from a previous jam, or the pivot was in the box from a previous jam, and they've trained for years and years and years to pass their star to that person, and they just do it because like that's their default thing. There's no reason to immediately penalize that kind of action, as long as those skaters realize what they've done and fix it and don't gain anything from it.
Okay. So at what point would it be penalizable if, say, the pivot took it illegally and started skating around the track? When would they be able to be penalized, or the star pass be able to be penalized?
So if a star pass is unsuccessful, no penalty is warranted, like, until such time that the skaters are aware that it was unsuccessful. So for example, if you're warning, it's the responsibility of the officials to warn the pivot that they're not the jammer if they have retained their original positions. Sometimes they already have the helmet cover on, sometimes they haven't put it on yet. Now, if I as a jammer referee warn a pivot that they're not the jammer, and after that time and after having, you know, received that communication, they put the helmet cover on, that's when it's penalizable. They know that they have retained their existing position, but their subsequent action is making it like more illegal, if that makes sense.
Would that penalty then go to the pivot that put the star on illegally?
Yes.
Okay.
We have another question, Apex.
Legendary Promise. Yeah. Hello. So I have a question regarding when there is an attempted star pass and the cover is dropped. So it was a specific situation that happened like a year ago, so I'm trying to remember it, but it was something along the lines of a jammer had successfully passed the cover, so there was a successful star pass, but just as the new jammer, the previous pivot, was leaving the pack, that the covers fell off and they didn't realize and continued to go around the pack. In this situation, as a jam ref, kind of who are you supposed to follow, and are you supposed to kind of give a verbal acknowledgement to that new jammer that that's happened, or kind of it's kind of a weird, tricky situation. I'm not sure what kind of should be done.
I'll take this one if that's okay. So if the pivot has become the jammer, they are now the jammer. If they lose their helmet cover, they are still the jammer. The jammer referee has no responsibility to tell them that they've lost their helmet cover, but they might realise themselves anyway, or their team might be yelling at them, "You've lost your cover." Yeah. Obviously at that point they're not scoring any points, they are an inactive jammer. But the jammer ref will still be following that skater as they are the jammer. Yeah, for sure. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, pretty much. And then if they, just kind of as a small addition, once they kind of get back to their scoring pass, I'm guessing then they obviously can't score those points until they have replaced the cover.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much.
No worries.
So we've had asked for clarification of when does the penalty go to the jammer who may have passed it to someone when someone was in a legal position? When does it go to the pivot? How do we decide if a penalty is worthy, who the penalty goes to?
Yes. I will say something quickly. So the important thing to differentiate between, for starters, is that it is legal for the pivot to be in control, like, of the star. It's legal for the pivot to have the star in their hand. So even in a situation where a star pass hasn't happened, for example, if the star has fallen to the floor, it's legal for the pivot to pick it up and give it back to the jammer. So if the jammer passes the star to a pivot who is out of bounds, for example, the star pass is unsuccessful, but it's legal for the pivot to be in control of the star. It is just as if they had picked it up from the floor, caught it out of the air, or anything like that. And so the penalty goes to the person that then turns that illegal action into a star pass illegally. And the way to do that is for the pivot to put it on their head. And so at that point, the pivot would be penalized for initiating that star pass, because they're the one who took that action of a star recovery situation and turned it into star pass territory. And so that's why the penalty would go to the pivot in that situation. And the penalty goes to the jammer in situations where the jammer has initiated the illegal star pass. For example, a jammer who is penalized passes the star to someone. This has any illegal action that has impact on the gameplay. So any illegal star pass that has an impact, if it's initiated by the jammer, that happens. So for example, in the situation where the blocker, a jammer gives the star to a non-pivot blocker, if the non-pivot blocker took the star and put it on their helmet and skated away, this is a penalty for the jammer, because the jammer initiated an illegal star pass. It's different than the pivot situation, because it's legal for the pivot to have the star. It's not legal for the pivot to put it on their head and skate away. It's not legal at all for the blocker to have the star. So if the jammer gives it to the blocker and then the blocker runs away, the jammer is issued a penalty, a star pass violation penalty. If the blocker were to grab the star off the helmet of the jammer, then that blocker has initiated an illegal star pass. And that's an illegal situation, and in that case, the penalty would go to that blocker.
So we have one last question, which I actually think is a really good one to end, because I think it's pretty common, it happens all the time, and it's also about the skill and technique. So what happens if the jammer ref is calling a penalty on someone as the jammer is tapping their hips? Will they finish calling the penalty or call the jam and then give the penalty to the skater? Kilobyte, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, so this has happened to me lots of times. So you're whistling a penalty, it might be on a block and maybe not even your jammer, whistling a penalty, halfway through spitting out a verbal cue, and then all of a sudden the jammer starts tapping their hips. So the priority in that situation is for the jam to end. So you would stop what you're saying, basically, stick your whistle back in your mouth, call off the jam, then finish the penalty. So it comes out as a nice big jumbly mess of whistles and verbal cues, but it does the job. So yeah, the priority is to end the jam, then finish the penalty call.
Thank you very much. I like that as a last question, because actually it really shows, when you're training to be a jammer ref, or what I've been told is, it's really about focusing on the jammer and understanding the points and understanding the calls offs and building it all up. And actually, that final action of calling off the jam is very important and should be a priority. So I just want to thank you all. Thanks once again to Kilobyte for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And otherwise, we've got all the questions you've answered. If there's any that we want to go back to, we will try and do that. Look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey, Toxic, hope you don't mind the shout out.
You're on mute.